Hello, my name is Caitlin Cross Harris, and I'm the K-12 Education and Research Specialist here at the National Women's History Museum. And I want to welcome you to More Than a Box Checked, adding women into the historical narrative. This is part one of our 2025 Virtual Educators Workshop, and what you are watching is an asynchronous version of our live event on June 25th, which means you will see moments that ask for participation. But don't worry, I'll walk you through how you can do this independently and with others. We at the museum do encourage you to register for our future events so that you can join us live. On the screen now is a QR code that will take you to the pre-assessment for this workshop. Even though this isn't live, we would still love it if you would take the time to complete it. Both the pre-assessment and the post-assessment not only allow us at the museum to see how we've helped you grow, but also gives you a chance to help us grow in return. The feedback you provide in the workshops helps us to continue to create future workshops that cater to teachers across the country. By the end of our time together, you'll have developed strategies to confidently include diverse historical narratives of women into your curriculum, no matter what grade level or subject you teach. You'll also gain a clearer understanding of the general timeline of women's history in the United States, along with key figures who have shaped our nation's history, many of whom are left out of traditional textbooks. In addition, we'll explore a variety of rigorous resources from primary and secondary sources to ready-to-use lesson plans that you can bring back to your classrooms and adapt for your students. To give you a bit about my journey as a teacher, I wanted to share a picture of my classroom the day before the first day of the school year. This was my sixth year of teaching total and my third year of teaching high school government. I know firsthand just how hard it is to be a teacher and to balance time. We're constantly being torn between curriculum demands, time constraints, and the weight of doing right by our students, often with limited support. When I first started teaching, I wasn't prepared for how important or how to create an inclusive history in my classroom. It wasn't something that I was taught in my teacher prep program, and honestly, it was something that I had to learn and unlearn on my own. That journey was sometimes uncomfortable, but it was always necessary. The space that we're in today is meant to be supportive, collaborative, and judgment free. Whether you're just starting to explore inclusive history or looking to deepen your practice, you're in the right place, and we're all here to learn together. Here's a look at our roadmap for today's workshop, so you can get a sense of where we're headed. We'll start with our first application session, wherein you will work independently or with others on a timeline. Next, we'll move into our first learning session, where we'll examine how history is commonly taught, who gets highlighted, who gets overlooked, and to start shifting that lens to bring women's contributions to the forefront. Then you'll see on here there is a chance for a short break to give yourself a chance to recharge, or if you just need a moment to digest all that information. After the break, we'll jump into our second learning session, and this will help us to reflect on the deeper purpose behind inclusive history and why it matters not just for content, but for student identity and critical thinking. And then finally, we'll close out with application session 2. And this is where you will have a chance to reflect, collaborate, and think about the real impact these changes can have on your classroom and your students' understanding of history. To really set our intentions for this workshop, I would like for you on a piece of paper, or maybe just internally, think about your experience as a K-12 student. Think about what you remember, what stuck out with you, or what was missing, and where those stories or people you didn't learn about until much later. I hope that time gave everyone a chance to think about their time as a student, but also reflect on your reason for being here. As we start thinking about how to bring more inclusive stories into our social studies classrooms and beyond, it helps us to take a moment to reflect on where many of us started, both as students and as educators. The truth is, we don't know what we don't know. And for many of us, our teacher preparation programs focus heavily on standards-based instruction, which is best practice, but oftentimes that means building our lessons around textbooks that by design center dominant narratives. This means that a lot of important voices, particularly those of women, people of color, and other marginalized communities, are left out. In the 2017 Where the Women report from the National Women's History Museum, it found that across state social studies standards, women's history is not only underrepresented, but often presented in limited traditional roles. So think wives, mothers, or helpers instead of leaders, trailblazers, or innovators. And here's something else to consider. Nearly 80% of women surveyed in the museum's Young Women and Girls Aspiration Report believe that they face more achievement barriers than men. But those challenges and the history of trailblazing women that came before them are rarely taught in K 12 classrooms. So we aren't talking about this to point fingers or to make anyone feel guilty. We are focusing on this data to shine a light on the gaps many of us didn't even know were there. Today, we're taking steps together to start filling those gaps with fuller, more honest history that reflects our shared history. And this work starts with awareness and then intentional action, which is what today is about. From that same report, we found that only 1/3 of women that were surveyed believe that they have as much power as men to create change. Let that sink in for a moment. This isn't a statistic from decades ago. It's about what young women and girls believe right now. Despite the progress that's been made, the message that many young people are still receiving, whether that be from media, politics, curriculum, or even from classroom experiences, it's that women don't hold equal power to shape the world around them. But here's the thing. If students don't see examples of women leading change, or if they aren't taught about the barriers women have faced and overcame, then it is easy for them to hold on to the belief that they are not revolutionaries in their own right. This is why representation in our curriculum matters. It's not just about fairness or inclusion, it's about shaping what students believe is possible for themselves and others. When we bring more women's story into the classroom, not as footnotes, but as central figures, we help to rewrite that narrative. We help all students, especially girls, see that power and change making are not traits determined by gender, but by their own potential. Welcome to our first application session. Now, on the screen, you will see a QR code that links to the Padlet that we used in our live session. However, the Padlet is no longer live, meaning that you cannot add to it. So instead, grab some paper and something to write with to create a timeline of American history broken down into 9 eras. These are the following eras: Colonial America from 1565 to 1763, Revolution and the New Nation 1763 to 1815, Expansion and Reform 1815 to 1860, Civil War and Reconstruction 1861 to 1877, Industrialization and the Gilded Age 1865 to 1877, the Progressive Era from 1900 to 1920, World Wars from 1914 to 1945, Cold War and the Space Race 1946 to 1991, and then finally Civil Rights Movement and Women's Movement 1950 to 1988. Once you have done that, set a timer for 5 minutes, and without using Google, try to name as many women in those eras as possible. I hope you found that activity both fun and challenging. But activities like this remind us that even as educators, we're often working within the limits of what we were taught. But with the right tools and collaboration, we can start to widen the lens not just for ourselves, but for our students. And that's what this workshop is about. To do what we're going to do, we're going to travel through the eras that we listed in our activity before. So what now? We've established that women are missing from the curriculum, but what do we do about it? And more importantly, how do we do it? I'm going to talk about women that challenge the dominant narrative, and we will also highlight moments in history where a woman's male contemporary overshadowed her work. Starting off with colonial America, we have John Winthrop. He was a long serving governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and is widely taught as a visionary leader. His famous phrase was "a city upon the hill," and it's still referenced today as a symbol of American exceptionalism. He helped many shape the Puritan colony structure and values, which earned him a central place in many U.S. history textbooks. But do you know her? This is Anne Hutchinson. So she lived in the same colony under Winthrop's leadership and became one of its most controversial and courageous figures. Hutchinson was a midwife, a mother of 15, and a deeply religious thinker who began holding meetings in her home to discuss scripture. This may not seem radical today, but at the time, it directly challenged the male religious authority in Puritan New England. She believed that a person's connection to God mattered more than following the rules set by religious leaders, which of course didn't sit well with the colony's leadership, aka Winthrop. Because her views challenged the male authority, it eventually led to her being put on trial for heresy, and in 1638 she was banished from the colony. Anne Hutchinson's story touches on big themes such as religious freedom, gender and power, along with standing up for one's beliefs. But here's the question. How often do we teach her story next to Winthrop? This comparison reminds us how vital it is to question whose perspectives are centered in our teaching and whose are pushed to the margins. That's the heart of what we're doing today. Next up, we have expansion and reform. So you know him, Horace Mann. Horace Mann is often referred to as the father of public education, and for good reason. He played a major role in the common school movement in the 19th century, which pushed for education that was free. His ideas shaped the public school system we know today, and his name pops up often in textbooks and state standards, but he was not the only person doing incredible things to equalize the playing field for education. Enter Elizabeth Jennings Graham. She was a pioneering educator, civil rights activist, and school founder who made her mark in the very same century. Despite this, she is often absent from traditional narratives. In 1854, Jennings Graham boarded a whites only streetcar in New York City and refused to get off. She was forcibly removed and later sued the streetcar company and won. This event earned her the nickname the 19th century Rosa Parks nearly 100 years before the Montgomery bus boycott. But her impact didn't stop there. She became a champion of education for Black children and advocated for better schooling opportunities and founded the first kindergarten for Black children in New York City. So, why is it that Mann's story is often taught while Jennings Graham is not? Her work is at the intersection of race, gender, and education reform. Her story offers an essential layer to our understanding of public education history. Including her story not only expands the narrative, but it makes it more truthful and complete. Susie King Taylor, for example, is another woman whose story can add a new layer to learning about a historical event or theme. She was the first Black Army nurse serving in the Civil War, which was a remarkable achievement at the time when both race and gender limited opportunities. Taylor was also an educator who taught both Black soldiers and children in the midst of war. Her courage and dedication went beyond traditional roles expected of women at the time. She wrote about her experience in her memoir, Reminiscences of My Life at Camp, which provides a powerful firsthand account of war, resilience, and the fight for freedom and equality. Including stories like Susie King Taylor's is about bringing rich, complex, inspiring narratives into our classrooms that deepen our understanding of history and show our students the true scope of women's contributions. And when we do this, we give all students a fuller picture of the past and more hope for the future. Now let's look at two influential figures from the abolition movement, one well known, the other less so. We know Frederick Douglass. He was a powerful abolitionist orator who escaped slavery and became a leading voice against it. Douglass also founded an influential anti slavery newspaper known as the North Star, and his legacy is widely taught in schools across the country. But do you know her? This is Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. And so, Harper was a Black poet, lecturer, and passionate advocate for abolition and women's suffrage. She used her writing and speeches to fight not only against slavery, but also for equal rights for women. While Douglass's name is almost synonymous with abolition, Harper's contributions, though equally powerful, are often overlooked in traditional history lessons. Her poetry and activism gave voice to the interconnected struggles for racial justice and gender equality, making her a key figure in both the abolitionist and suffragist movements. It's easy to fall into a pattern of adding women into the narrative without being intentional, which can look like a brief mention without fully exploring the layers that make these women's story so powerful and relevant. But the history of women's activism is rich, complex, and deeply interconnected with broader social movements. Take Clara Limelick. She wasn't just a labor leader, she was a working class immigrant woman who sparked the uprising of the 20,000, which was a massive strike of garment workers that challenged exploitative labor conditions. Her activism brought a unique layer to the labor movement, and Limelick's work highlighted the labor of women workers who were often pushed to the sidelines both in unions and in their communities. Another point to consider is about who we choose to highlight, even when we're discussing or studying moments in history that are considered women centric, such as the suffrage movement. For example, is the life of Ida B. Wells Barnett. Her story adds an essential layer to our understanding of the suffrage movement because, as a journalist and anti lynching activist, Wells Barnett challenged mainstream suffragists to confront the realities of racism and violence that Black women faced, issues too often ignored within the movement. Her work reminds us that racial justice and gender equality are inseparable struggles. Together, these two women help us to see how labor rights and suffrage were not monolithic movements, but complex, overlapping battles shaped by race, class, and gender. By including these layered narratives into our teaching, we open up a fuller, more honest history that reflects the diversity and depth of women's experiences and activism. When we teach about military history, particularly World War I, we often focus on the contributions of combat units and technological advancements. The U.S. Signal Corps, this was a branch of or a vital part of the war effort, and they handled everything from critical communication tasks like telegraph, telephone, to early military photography. They were also instrumental in the development of Army aviation. At the same time the Signal Corps were being celebrated, the Hello Girls were forgotten. This was a group of over 200 women who served in the First World War as telephone operators for the Signal Corps. They were fluent in both English and French, and they were critical in maintaining real time battlefield communication between US and French forces. Their speed and accuracy saved lives and directly influenced combat outcomes. But despite wearing uniforms, swearing military oaths, and serving under Army command, they were denied veteran status for decades. And this is a stark reminder of how women's service has historically been sidelined or erased. The Hello Girls bring an important perspective to how we think about communication and service during wartime. They push back against the traditional image of a soldier and remind us that women have always been a part of history. Let's switch to the Mothers Society of Minidoka. So, this was a group of Japanese American women incarcerated during World War II at the Minidoka internment camp in Idaho. These women weren't just surviving, they were organizing and they worked to support families and children under harsh conditions of incarceration. They preserved Japanese cultural traditions in the face of policies designed to strip them of their identity, and they maintained community morale. They led civic and cultural activities, they kept spirits up with events and education, and even protested the military draft of their Nisei sons, or the young Japanese American men who were being asked to fight for a country that had imprisoned them. This is women's history. It's layered, resilient, and deeply connected to civic life and justice. The story of the Mothers Society isn't just about incarceration or about women, it's about what resistance looks like in everyday life. It's the lens through which we can understand the intersections of identity, resistance, and community in moments that textbooks often gloss over. I want to talk about another example of how nuanced and multi layered history can be. The civil rights movement is often included in history standards, but what is rarely present is the Chicana movement. Within this movement, we can dive even deeper into the life and work of Dolores Huerta. So she co founded the United Farm Workers alongside Cesar Chavez, but too often his name is mentioned where Huerta was organizing strikes, negotiating contracts, and mobilizing communities, not only for labor rights, but for Latina rights and civil rights, along with gender equity. And it was Huerta who gave us the powerful rallying cry, Si se puede, or yes, we can. Research shows us that the Chicana voices have often been left out of our mainstream US curricula. So when we skip over leaders like Huerta, it sends a message that the contributions of Latino and Chicana women are not as important. Adding women's history into our curriculum is a necessary correction. It's about reclaiming narratives and giving our students a more accurate and inclusive understanding of movements that shaped the world around them. When we teach about the space race, we often focus on astronauts like John Glenn or Neil Armstrong, men who were front and center, literally rocketing into the spotlight. But the story behind those missions is incomplete without the women who made the math work. Enter Katherine Johnson. So she was a brilliant mathematician, and Johnson's calculations of orbital mechanics were essential to the success of US space missions, including John Glenn's historic 1962 orbit and the Apollo 11 mission that landed Americans on the moon. She contributed to Mercury, Apollo, and Space Shuttle programs, often performing by hand the calculations that computers couldn't be trusted to get right. And she did all of this as a Black woman in segregated 1960s America, working in a field dominated by white men. Katherine Johnson's story isn't just inspiring, it's essential to telling the full truth about American scientific achievement. It's about civil rights and about what it means to contribute, even while being excluded. While that was a lot of information, I hope this has revealed how layered history can be. I encourage you to pause this and take a break to digest everything. And when you get back, we're going to talk about what does this look like in the classroom, and better yet, how to do it. So take the time to do whatever fills your cup, and I will see you soon. I want to give everybody a recap and to orient us where we are in the workshop now that we've taken our break. We've made a timeline, and we went on an eras tour, and now we're going to go through some of the educational reasons behind including women's history in our curriculum and what it does for our students. And after that, we're going to do one more application session, then wrap up. From that same 2017 report, Where Are the Women?, we get the statistic that less than 15% of history taught in US classrooms focuses on women. So, in a country where over half the population is female, our curriculum often tells the story of America as if women were mostly bystanders or, at best, occasional contributors to real history. This imbalance isn't just a problem of representation, it's a problem of truth. We are giving students an incomplete and often inaccurate version of the past. When women's contributions are reduced to a paragraph, a side panel, or once a month in the school year, we miss crucial stories that are of leadership, resistance, and innovation. We also lose the opportunity to show students how women have shaped every aspect of American life, from politics, science, labor, education, and beyond. This gap has real consequences. Girls and young women may not see themselves as historical agents or capable leaders. Boys and young men may occasionally internalize the idea that leadership and innovation are inherently male domains. And all students lose out on a richer, more inclusive understanding of the forces that have shaped our nation. And so, this workshop again is about recognizing we can't just sprinkle women into the curriculum and consider it inclusive. We must rethink the narrative of who it centers, whose voices we amplify, and how we define historical significance. Let's take a look at what happens when we apply this idea to actual historical content. What and who gets left out? Including women's history gives us a fuller, more accurate view of the past, and when curriculum centers only dominant narratives, it distorts history and limits understanding. It also highlights the contributions of over half the population, helping all students, but especially our girls, see themselves in stories of progress, resistance, and leadership. Research by Latz and Billings shows that culturally relevant teaching boosts engagement and critical thinking. Women's history is also key to that relevance. Finally, it encourages students to think critically about whose stories are told and why. Teaching women's history isn't just about adding names, it's about asking deeper questions and empowering students to challenge the status quo. One of the most persistent patterns in traditional history teaching is the great man narrative, which is the idea that a few powerful, usually white men, moved history forward. While these figures matter, this approach narrows our view of history of the past. And it's a challenging of this model that means shifting the focus from individual heroes to the collective power of social movements and everyday people, including women, who helped drive change. As Weinberg in their 2001 study describes, this is part of a democratization of history. Women led strikes, they ran schools, they published papers, and fought for reforms. Blevins and Salinas argue that teaching these stories shows students that history is shaped by many voices, not just a few famous names. This also fosters critical thinking. As Epstein and Peck in their 2017 study note, when students examine histories that are remembered or left out, they build deeper historical understanding and stronger civic awareness. So, how can we implement this in the classroom? When teaching the labor movement, include Clara Limelick alongside more familiar male leaders like Eugene Debs. Let students analyze her speech that sparked the 1909 garment strike and then compare it to traditional textbook excerpts or work from the other leaders of the time. This opens discussion on gender, power, and how narratives are shaped. Either internally or within a group that you're with right now, I want you to think about how you have taught civic engagement and resistance in your classroom. When we think about labor and resistance in history, we're often presented with a narrow picture. This perspective overlooks the deep everyday labor and acts of resistance carried out by women, especially women of color, immigrant women, and working class women, whose contributions have historically been erased or undervalued. This work is about uncovering how women resisted oppression, both in everyday acts and bold public defiance. Women organized behind the scenes, sustained families, and spoke out when it was dangerous. They also shaped social movements even when denied leadership. So, to teach this in the classroom, we can think back to the story of the Mother Society of Minidoka alongside broader lessons on Japanese American incarceration. Let students analyze how these women preserved culture, supported families, and protested injustice against the anti Japanese propaganda at the time. You can ask questions like whose labor built this world and whose resistance made our rights possible. In doing so, we expand students' understanding of justice, history, and their own agency. As we've seen today, women have long been central to social movements, but their stories are often left out. Women like Elizabeth Jennings Graham, who challenged segregation and promoted education, Dolores Huerta, who organized farm workers and co founded the UFW, and Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, an abolitionist and suffragist, all show how women have shaped reform in suffrage, labor, civil rights, and education. These women organized from the ground up, building coalitions, leading protests, and demanding policy change. Their stories remind us that social movements aren't just about famous names, but about collective action, often led by women on the front lines and behind scenes. So, again, how can we implement this in the classroom? Have students select a historical female reformer like Harper or Huerta and pair her with a contemporary activist working in a similar space. Students can create a comparison chart or a mini poster analyzing their goals and methods, how historical context that they worked in shaped their activism, and how the past informs today's activism. This is not only a building of historical understanding, but it also connects students to the living legacy of women's civic leadership in the past. Many mothers of the civil rights movement, such as Septima Clark and Fannie Lou Hamer, played key roles in grassroots organizing, voter registration, and community education. Their leadership, though often overshadowed, reveals how social change was rooted in women's lived experiences and care for their communities. Additionally, many laws and reforms from Jim Crow voting restrictions to labor policies were designed to also influence women's lives. Teaching history through this gender lens, as Epstein shows, builds empathy and reveals the interconnectedness of social, political, and personal histories. So, what does this look like in the classroom? So, women's impact timeline. So, you can have students create a timeline similar to what we've done here today that highlights key laws, reforms, and actions led by key women who helped shape those civil rights and broader social change. They will select 2 or 3 women whose activism had an impact on major reforms, and they will place those stories in a timeline, emphasizing what change looked like through their eyes, much like what we've done here today. To return to the topic of women in war, women have always been present, fighting, healing, resisting, and leading. And during World War II, President Franklin D. Roosevelt famously said, "Today we are engaged in a total war. We cannot afford the luxury of indulging in prejudice." He, of course, was speaking on race, but it also highlighted the efforts of women at the time, too. So, from Susie King Taylor, who served as a nurse and educator during Civil War, to the Hello Girls, operating switchboards in World War I, to the Mother Society of Minidoka, resisting injustice during Japanese incarceration, women have always been an integral part to wartime efforts. These aren't exceptions, they're evidence that women's capabilities have always been present and war simply made their contributions harder to ignore. Yet too often, these narratives get sidelined in textbooks as if they're secondary, and that omission distorts both our understanding of war and our assumptions of gender. So, how can we implement this in the classroom? We suggest have students make a missing chapter page for a textbook by including a woman who played a major role in a wartime conflict, or any conflict for that matter, The page should include primary sources and text that explains how her history expands the narrative and fills the gap. This engages students with real historical inquiry, but it also gives them some ownership on creating history themselves. To recap, one of the most important questions we can ask ourselves is whose story gets told and who gets left out? When we teach history, we're not just teaching facts, we are teaching our students what matters, whose contributions count, who holds power, and who shapes the world. The omission of women from historical narratives isn't just a gap, it reinforces systemic gender biases and what is accepted as legitimate knowledge and leadership. Research shows that curriculum is identity work. What students see or don't see shapes how they understand themselves and others. A curriculum that fails to reflect students' lived experiences can alienate learners and limit their engagement. On the other hand, an inclusive curriculum, one that represents women, especially those from historically marginalized communities, cultivates belonging and historical inquiry. When we broaden the narrative to include women like Dolores Huerta, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and Susan King Taylor, we aren't just adding names, we're building a richer, more accurate account of history and helping students develop the analytical tools to question dominant narratives. Doing the work of adding women's history into our curriculum is about equipping students to think rigorously and feel connected, as well as understanding act or how to act with civic purpose. Now it's time for our second application session. Whether you are working independently or with others, please return to our timeline that we made at the beginning of the workshop. Beside each woman you listed in those eras, do some research to determine how her story expands the narrative and jot it down. We suggest that you allot 15 minutes to complete this task. Before we move on, let's take a few minutes to reflect together on what that experience was like. What was surprising or challenging about this activity? But I do want to say, you all just did something that goes far beyond plugging names into a timeline. You analyzed, you contextualized, and you challenged historical norms. That's the kind of critical work we want to model for our students. Next, I want to bring your attention to our resources that we have on our website. Our biographies feature detailed profiles of influential women across U.S. history. They are searchable by time period, theme, or topic. This is great for student research, warm-ups, or timeline activities like we've done today. Next up, we have virtual field trips that I host, and they are interactive virtual experiences exploring key women's history topics. This includes educator guides and reflection questions as well. It's ideal for classroom use or homework assignments. Then we have our lesson plans. These are ready to use lesson plans on our women's history. They have topics created by our For Educators by Educators cohort members. It incorporates primary sources, inquiry-based learning, and activities. It's organized by grade level and subject area. And then next up, we have our National History Day aid, where we will provide support materials for students and teachers participating in National History Day. It features topic ideas, research tips, and recommended resources. It also highlights women's stories that connect with annual themes. And then finally is our affiliate bookshop. This is a curated collection of books on women's history for all ages, and it supports independent bookstores and the museum's mission. Useful for building a classroom or school library with inclusive texts. Thank you all so much for being here today and for the curiosity, courage, and collaboration you brought to this space. We've explored how women's history is complex and a vital part of creating a fuller, more honest, and more empowering narrative for our students and ourselves. Let's connect all the dots. We've explored the why and the how. Now, here's some key takeaways and tools to help us continue this work. So, we have to be intentional when adding women's history into our lessons by asking, how does her story or narrative add to the lesson? Second, ensuring that the way in which we talk about women's history in the lesson sends the message that her history is not optional. And finally, that we ensure that our students know of the trailblazers that have come before them. Women's history does not have to be limited to the social studies classroom, but can be applied in different content areas. And then finally, please complete the post assessment on the QR code on the screen. As mentioned before, it helps us to grow. I hope today gave you something meaningful, whether it's a new perspective, a woman's story you have never heard before, or just the validation that this work matters, because it does. Thank you again. Keep in touch, keep teaching boldly, and I hope to see you guys in future events.